Welcome to Cisco HyperFlex video series. This is scaling and expanding a deployment. One of the major features of Cisco HyperFlex data platform is its ability to scale the infrastructure beyond the initial installation, without any maintenance downtime. And you can scale the infrastructure from 3 all the way up to 64 nodes. Adding a node provides additional compute and memory resources to the cluster, and in case of the converged nodes, expands the storage of the common data platform. This expansion was previously available only on vSphere regular clusters, but with the version 3.5, it is now available in standard Hyper-V clusters and stretch clusters as well. To install an additional node, the same considerations apply as in the initial installation. The node must be compatible with a storage type, storage size, generation, chassis size, and similar in RAM and compute power to the existing nodes. You can, however, introduce an M5 node to an M4 cluster, but not vice versa. Much of the scaling procedure is similar to the initial installation in this way. Here is the current setup of the cluster we have already installed. We will expand the cluster with an additional node and connect the node to each of the 2 fabric interconnects. We will also choose another set of addresses for the new node. The installation of an additional node is done through the HX installer, which we have initially used to install the cluster. Since the installer remembers the last activity, we will start over. We have installed the cluster through installation workflow. Now we will add a node through expand standard cluster workflow. We will use a pre-prepared configuration file that we previously exported from the installer to make the installation faster. We have to provide the credentials for the UCS Manager, vCenter, and the ESXi hosts, the same as when we first installed the cluster. The passwords are never saved. We now choose the cluster we want to expand, and we have the previously installed cluster listed here. We could also add another cluster by providing its cluster address. We will expand the listed cluster. In the next step, we are presented by a list of unassociated servers. Currently, we only have the new server listed. You can see in the Associated tab the servers which have already been configured and are the existing part of the HyperFlex cluster. On the following screen, we provide the addressing for the new node. Be careful that the IP addresses do not overlap with the existing nodes. It is also good practice to follow the initial addressing logic. VLANs will not be pre-populated for you, so be careful to add the same values as you have on the initial install. In the hypervisor configuration, we provide the IP address and the name to be configured on the hypervisor of the new node. In the next step, we also add addressing in the VLANs, just as on the initial install, and we are done. We start the installation and wait for the installer to finish. On the summary screen, the information of the entire cluster will be shown. Now you can already log into the HX Connect and review the cluster status. Now we have 6 converged nodes available, where we previously only had 5. We have only added 1 node as an example. We could repeat this process, adding 1 or many nodes until the 64 node limit for the HX cluster would be reached. To finish the configuration of the new node, we still have to run the post-installation script to configure the vMotion interfaces, high availability, and DRS. The new node is now empty, but it is already used for writing. The cluster will automatically rebalance the existing information on the cluster so that it will be distributed evenly. The converged nodes are not the only way you can expand a HyperFlex cluster. You can also add compute-only nodes to vSphere regular and stretch clusters. A compute-only node is a server, which only provides compute power, so processing and memory for running virtual machines. But even though it can have local disks, it does not add these disks to the shared data platform, like the converged nodes do. Alongside the HX converged nodes, you can utilize an ever-increasing number of Cisco UCS platforms as compute-only nodes. Currently, several options from the latest UCS generations are supported. The compute-only nodes must still be connected to the same UCS domain as the converged nodes, and each node must have the HyperFlex Data Platform software installed through the HX installer and a customized version of the hypervisor. A compute node mounts the HyperFlex shared storage in the hypervisor through NFS Share, in the same way a converged node does, but its disks are not added to the shared pool. A compute-only node only runs the VMs running on the HyperFlex cluster and is effectively a part of the same vSphere cluster. The storage for reading and writing information exists on the converged node. The CVM and the IO-visor are still responsible for distributing the reads and writes across the cluster, but a compute-only node cannot be chosen as the target. Performance-wise, this is the same as when a VM on a converged node performs storage operations, since in HyperFlex the reads and writes are always inherently done through the network. Since the compute-only nodes do not participate in the cluster write operations, they do not compress and deduplicate data, as converged nodes do. This is why the CVM requirements on a compute-only node are lower than on a converged node. A CVM on a compute-only node only requires 1 vCPU and 512 megabytes of RAM, which is significantly lower than on converged nodes. This allows you, for example, to repurpose your existing UCS infrastructure and integrate it as compute-only nodes in a HyperFlex cluster. A lot of options are currently available and keep being added, so consult the compatibility sheet to verify which models are applicable. Keep in mind that the number of compute-only nodes is limited by the number of converged nodes. Until HyperFlex 3.5, you could only use the same number of compute-only nodes as you had converged nodes. Since the version 3.5, you can use twice as many compute nodes as you have converged nodes with the HyperFlex Enterprise license. But as of version 3.5, the total maximum number of nodes in a HyperFlex cluster is still 64. The expansion options of Cisco HyperFlex provide a pay-as-you-grow approach and provide you with additional options for your existing infrastructure. The supported maximum size of a HyperFlex cluster has also grown from version to version, along with ever more flavors supporting the expansion with converged or compute-only nodes. The scaling of Cisco HyperFlex also provides a natural basis for a private cloud deployment, which can easily and quickly be expanded to meet the changing demands on your infrastructure. This was scaling and expanding a deployment. Thank you for watching.